Good evening, and welcome to Lullaby Murders. This is a place for true stories told calmly, without rush, created for rest, reflection, or quiet listening. There is nothing for you to solve tonight, only a story to move through slowly and carefully. Tonight, we return to Baltimore County, Maryland, where on January 13th, 1999, 18-year-old Hae Min Lee left Woodlawn High School and never arrived to pick up her young cousin from daycare. Weeks later, her body was found buried in Leakin Park, and her former boyfriend, Adnan Syed, was convicted of her murder in 2000. Years later, the case would be re-examined through appeals, documentaries, and global debate, raising questions about evidence, memory, and certainty. Tonight, we move carefully through the timeline, not to argue and not to persuade, but to understand how an ordinary Wednesday became one of the most discussed cases in modern true crime. January 1999. The air is unusually mild for winter, and the trees in Leakin Park stand bare, but not yet frozen. School hallways echo, with lockers closing and students planning their afternoons. At Woodlawn High School, it is the middle of the week, a Wednesday, and nothing about that morning suggests what will follow. Tonight we begin carefully with Hae Min Lee. Hae Min Lee is 18 years old, a senior with plans, routines, and responsibilities that already lean toward adulthood. She was born on October 15th, 1980 in South Korea, and in 1992, at 12 years old, she moved to the United States with her mother, Yoon Kim, and her younger brother, Young Lee. They settled in Baltimore County while her father remained in South Korea. The move was not casual, and it was not temporary. It was a sacrifice made in pursuit of education and opportunity, and by most accounts, Hae understood that. At Woodlawn High School, she was enrolled in the magnet program, a selective academic track grouping high-achieving students for advanced coursework. About 25 students shared most of their classes, spending hours together and forming bonds that could feel like a small world inside a much larger school. Hae was academically capable, but she was also energetic, expressive, and athletic. She played field hockey, wrestled, and ran cross-country, though it was lacrosse where she was most remembered, described by teammates as graceful, quick, and joyful. Outside school, she worked part-time at Lentz Crafters in Owings Mills and spoke about becoming an optician. Her diary, later entered into evidence, reflects a young woman who thought ahead, who planned, who set goals. It also reflects intensity, not unusual, not shocking, but the kind many teenagers carry quietly and pour into pages when they do not want to speak out loud. In that same magnet program is Adnan Syed, born in 1981 to Pakistani immigrant parents and raised in a devout Muslim household. His family attends the Islamic Society of Baltimore, and his upbringing emphasizes faith discipline, and academic excellence. At school, he is well liked, tall, soft-spoken, and charismatic. Someone who plays football, runs track, and volunteers as an EMT, an emergency medical technician. He is not viewed as volatile, and he is not known for violence. That context matters because what follows has never sat comfortably inside a simple narrative. Hae and Adnan begin dating in 1998 when they are both 17. And at first, it feels like an ordinary high school relationship. There are prom photographs. Friends remember them holding hands, passing notes, sharing private jokes. But there are complications. Adnan's family does not approve of dating before marriage, and Hae's family, while less religious, still holds traditional expectations. Their relationship becomes secret in practice, unfolding through late-night conversations and pagers, those small beeping devices common in the late 1990s. They even develop a system. If one pages the other, the recipient calls a 1-800 number, often the weather service, and waits on hold while the other calls back, creating a call-waiting beep instead of a ringing phone that might wake a parent. It is inventive, and it is revealing, because secrecy often adds intensity. Hae's diary reflects both affection and friction. She writes about jealousy and arguments, about what she describes as possessiveness, and she also writes about love. That contradiction is common at 17. It does not automatically suggest danger, but it is part of the picture. By late autumn, the relationship cools, and in December 1998, they break up. Hae begins dating someone else, Don Clindenst, a co-worker from Lentz Crafters, who is 22 years old. According to some friends, the relationship seems calmer, steadier, and less hidden. Hae's diary suggests she is deeply invested, and quickly. In one online entry, she lists her interests and includes Don with striking emphasis, the kind that feels intensely teenage and entirely sincere. It does not necessarily mean anything ominous. It simply shows where her emotional energy is moving as the year turns. By most accounts, Adnan appears composed about the breakup. He continues attending school, going to track practice, and spending time at the mosque. But breakups at 17 are rarely uncomplicated, even when they appear calm on the surface. Hae is the kind of person whose life can be traced through routine, not because she is dull or predictable, but because she carries responsibility quietly. At 18, she is already balancing school, work, and family expectations. And each afternoon, she does something that anchors her day. She picks up her young cousin from daycare. It is not a dramatic detail. It is not cinematic. It is simple. And because it is simple, it becomes powerful later. Because when a routine breaks, people notice, not because they expect the worst, but because patterns are reliable. In Hae's world, those patterns are everywhere. The magnet program at Woodlawn creates its own small ecosystem. A tight group moving through shared classrooms, and shared pace, the kind of environment where people know your habits without realizing they do. She is remembered as someone who moves quickly through that space, who laughs easily, who seems outwardly capable. At the same time, her diary shows what many diaries show. Not a perfect portrait, but a private one. Her words move between confidence and uncertainty, between affection and frustration, between careful plans and sudden emotion. That is not unusual. It is teenage life. And it is also why the diary later becomes something the prosecution leans on, because it contains a record of feelings. But feelings are not evidence of actions. They are context, and context in court can be shaped into motive. In the final months of 1998, Hae's relationship with Adnan begins to shift. What started in secrecy, late calls, pagers, and a system designed not to wake parents, had created its own private world behind bedroom doors. When that world ends in December, it is not just a breakup. It is the quiet collapse of something hidden and intense. And almost immediately, Hae begins leaning towards something new. Don Clindenst is older, 22, and works at Lentz Crafters. By some accounts, the relationship feels steadier, less hidden, and less complicated by religious boundaries. As investigators later learn, Hae is also active online in OL chat rooms and Asian chat spaces, where she maintains a profile listing her interests. Under likes, she includes Don not casually, but with the kind of emphasis that suggests she is fully invested. She writes about his blue-gray eyes, his Camaro, driving to Bel Air, selling glasses, spending as much time as possible in the lab, part-time sales, full-time girlfriend. It is not a confession, and it is not proof of anything. It is simply a snapshot of where her emotional energy is moving as the year turns. There are other small markers as well. Hae leaves behind her Korean passport. She leaves behind her diary. She has not picked up her final Lentz Crafters paycheck. There is mention that she may have taken one of her mother's credit cards, though there is no activity showing it was used. These are the details police consider when they are still asking a basic question. Did she leave voluntarily, or did something happen to her? At the beginning, they do not know. They see a teenager who is legally an adult, a missing car, and no immediate sign of violence. That early uncertainty matters because it shapes the urgency of the response. The night before Hae disappears, January 12th, Don tells police she is at his home in Bel Air. He says she leaves around 10:30 p.m., arrives home around 11:30, and that he pages her to confirm she arrived safely. They then speak by phone late into the night, until around 3 a.m. during that call. Don says Adnan tries to reach her at home, and when she answers, his purpose is simple: to give her his new cell phone number, a phone he had obtained just the day before. Hae writes the number down and returns to her call. It is an ordinary moment, a number exchanged, a brief interruption. But in a case that later revolves around phone records and timing, even ordinary details take on new weight. On the morning of January 13th, Hae goes to school as usual. She is seen by friends, attends classes, and moves through the day without visible disruption. That afternoon, she is expected to do what she always does, pick up her cousin from daycare. She is also scheduled for a 6 p.m. shift at the Owings Mills location of Lentz Crafters, a shift she will not arrive for. It is the first time she has missed work without calling. Another pattern breaks. Another ordinary expectation becomes silence. And in stories like this, change does not arrive with noise. It arrives with absence. Wednesday, January 13th, 1999 unfolds like any other. School ends at approximately 2:15 p.m. Hae leaves campus in her gray 1998 Nissan Sentra. She does not arrive at the daycare. When she fails to appear, the first reaction is not violence, but confusion, then concern, and then the steady, practical movement families fall into when someone cannot be reached. Phone calls to friends, to coworkers, to neighbors. The quiet hope that it is a misunderstanding, that she lost track of time, that she will walk in and apologize. But she does not. And those who know her best repeat the same description. She is responsible, routine-driven, not someone who disappears without telling someone. Police begin, as they often do in missing person cases involving an 18-year-old, considering the possibility that she left voluntarily, that she is upset with a boyfriend, or simply does not want to come home. Resources are triaged, and without clear evidence of danger, urgency can build slowly. But routine changes that. A cousin waits at daycare. A family waits at home. A workplace expects her at 6. As those people begin calling around, the missing person becomes real, not abstract, but immediate. In those earliest hours, investigators focus on the obvious circle: family, friends, and recent relationships. 2 names surface quickly: Adnan Syed, the recent ex, and Don Clintonst, the new boyfriend. There is mention that Adnan asked Hae for a ride after school, and that she may have agreed. Even if the story is innocent, that detail narrows the window of time and draws attention. Don, older and working with Hae, is someone who may have seen her or expected to hear from her. At first, though, the question is not who did it. It is simply where she was going and who she might have met. Police go to Lentz Crafters at the Owings Mills Mall to determine whether Hae came in that day and to speak with Don. They learn that Don is not there because on January 13th, he is working at a different location in Hunt Valley, covering a shift in the lab where lenses are made. His manager states that his hours run from around 9 a.m. until 6 p.m., with a lunch break in the early afternoon. Officers attempt to reach Don by phone on the day Hae is reported missing, but they are unable to contact him until after midnight. Don later says he had been working and then home since 7 p.m. The delay becomes one of the details people discuss in hindsight, not because it proves guilt, but because in well-known cases, irregularities often appear more significant once the outcome is known. Later commentators note that early documentation around Don's alibi is not as thorough or publicly transparent as some would prefer. Some argue police did not immediately verify his time cards in a way that satisfies later scrutiny. Others point to employment records and subpoenas obtained afterward. Because the paperwork is not cleanly presented from the beginning, rumors develop, including speculation about Dawn's mother's connection to management at the Hunt Valley location, and questions about time records. It becomes a side argument within a case already filled with side arguments. In those early days, however, investigators are focused on standard procedure. They identify recent partners, ask for timelines, request alibis, and continue searching for Hae's car. Without the car, there is no scene, only absence. Days pass, and winter moves quietly forward. On February 9th, the case changes shape because the missing person becomes a homicide victim. Once that happens, the previous month is re-examined as evidence. Every phone call, every memory, every small decision becomes sharper. The system that moved cautiously at first now accelerates because there is a body, and the possibility that she simply left is no longer viable. As concern grows in the early days of her disappearance, Hae's family contacts friends and acquaintances. No one has seen her after school. One detail becomes central later. Adnan tells police he asked Hae for a ride that afternoon. He says she initially agreed and must have changed her mind before leaving. Other students recall hearing that he asked for a ride. Some remember it clearly. Others are uncertain. It is a narrow hinge on which much turns. If Hae agreed to give Adnan a ride, that places him with her during the crucial window after school. If she did not, the timeline shifts. Hae is officially reported missing on January 13th. At first, law enforcement considers the possibility that she left voluntarily. She is 18 and legally an adult. But days pass without confirmed sightings, without meaningful communication, and her car remains missing. By early February, nearly a month later, there is still no resolution. On February 9th, 1999, a maintenance worker named Alonzo Sellers discovers a partially buried body in a wooded area of Leakin Park. It is Hae Min Lee. The medical examiner later determines the cause of death to be manual strangulation. There are no gunshot wounds and no stabbing. Her body has been concealed in a shallow grave. The investigation shifts fully to homicide. Detectives focus on Hae's recent relationships and her movements on January 13th. They interview Adnan, who maintains he has no involvement and says he was at school and later at track practice. He does not recall specific details of that afternoon, a lack of memory that will later be scrutinized, though at the time it was an ordinary Wednesday for most students. Memory is often unreliable when events do not seem significant in the moment. Adnan owns a cell phone, which in 1999 is less common for teenagers. The phone was purchased on January 12th, the day before Hae disappears. Detectives obtain call records including incoming and outgoing calls and cell tower data. Interpretation of those records will later become central to both conviction and appeal. But at this stage, investigators are still constructing a basic timeline. In late February, detectives speak with Jay Wilds, an acquaintance of Adnan, who is not part of the magnet program, but knows people within that wider circle. Jay tells police that Adnan confessed to killing Hae and claims he was shown her body in the trunk of her car. He says he helped bury her in Leakin Park. This statement changes the course of the investigation and introduces complexities that persist for years. Jay's accounts shift over time, timelines adjust, and locations change. Yet the core claim remains that Adnan killed Hae. Detectives use information Jay provides to locate Hae car in a grassy lot behind row houses in Baltimore's Allendale area, near 300 Edgewood Street. That discovery reinforces Jay's credibility in the eyes of investigators. On February 28, 1999, Adnan Syed is arrested. He is 17 at the time of the crime and 18 at arrest, and he is charged with first-degree murder. From this point forward, the case becomes, in many ways, a contest of narratives. In court, narratives are not supposed to matter, but they often do, because juries are human and humans look for coherence. Returning to January 13th and moving hour by hour, Woodlawn High School begins the day as usual. Students arrive before 7:45 a.m. Classes rotate in blocks, and multiple classmates later confirm seeing Hae that morning. Nothing appears unusual, and there is no documented argument or confrontation inside the building. The ride request, however, remains in the background. Adnan tells police he asked Hae for a ride because his own car was unavailable. He says she agreed and later must have left without him. For some observers, this becomes a pivotal moment. For others, it is a misunderstanding amplified by hindsight. At approximately 2:15 p.m., the final bell rings and students begin leaving campus. Hae is seen heading toward her gray 1998 Nissan Sentra. She needs to pick up her cousin by around 3:15, a timeline that under normal conditions would be manageable. She never arrives, and by 3:30 concern begins building at the daycare, leading to contact with her family. The window between roughly 2:15 and 6 p.m. becomes the most contested span of the case. Adnan says he remains at school and later attends track practice, which begins around 4 p.m. His coach recalls him being present, though attendance is informal and not documented with timestamps. Memory is once again asked to carry weight it was never designed to bear. Phone records add another layer. A call at 2:36 p.m. later becomes significant. Jay describes it as a come and get me call, claiming Adnan contacted him from a payphone and said Hae was dead. According to Jay, he then picked Adnan up. Jay's version of events changes over time. In his first major recorded statement on February 28th, he says the body was shown to him off Edmondson Avenue. By March 15th, he places both the murder and the trunk seen at a Best Buy parking lot, explaining that earlier inconsistencies were influenced by fear of surveillance cameras. In later interviews, he shifts the trunk location again to his grandmother's house. The prosecution acknowledges these changes, but argues that the core narrative remains consistent. Adnan killed Hae, Jay saw the body, and they buried her together. The defense argues that shifting details undermine reliability. When Jay leads police to Hae's Nissan Sentra, the vehicle is towed to Baltimore Police Headquarters for processing. Inside a controlled environment, investigators photograph, fingerprint, inventory, and collect evidence. What they find is not sensational, but personal. The belongings of a teenager. Hae's field hockey and lacrosse sticks are in the car, along with a dark blue book bag with a brown leather bottom. Inside the bag is Shakespeare's Othello. There are senior portrait proofs with an order form and a Woodlawn High School agenda book for 1998 to 1999, with Hae's name and Don's name written on the front cover. A photograph inside shows Hae with a young man in military uniform. Police initially assume he may be an ex-boyfriend. Later defense materials indicate he is Jake, a friend who died the previous summer, and whom Hae described as someone who truly understood her. On the front left seat, investigators find a blue, white, and green striped t-shirt with what appears to be blood, later confirmed as Hae's. 2 hairs recovered from the shirt do not match Adnan Syed or Jay Wilde's. There is an empty juice carton, roses and baby's breath wrapped in plastic with flower food, an introductory psychology textbook, the lid of a travel mug, a gas receipt dated January 5th, and a floppy disk labeled school stuff. Among these items is a pair of black-heeled dress shoes, women's size 7, widely believed to be the shoes Hae wore that day. Years later, advanced DNA testing identifies multiple DNA profiles on the shoes, none matching Adnan or Jay. That fact becomes part of the 2022 reinvestigation narrative. Even here, however, caution is necessary. The absence of DNA does not automatically establish innocence, and the presence of DNA does not automatically establish guilt. Everyday objects can carry traces from many people over time. Yet, in a case without a definitive forensic tie, every detail, however small, can assume greater weight. The inventory of the car continues, revealing ordinary personal items rather than dramatic evidence. A pair of black socks, a pinstriped skirt, Nike trainers, stuffed animals, a happy birthday crown, and a note to Dawn referencing plans and school details. In the glove box, there is a vehicle registration, a map of the Baltimore Zoo, a small gift box, a heart charm with a price tag, a university admissions card, mail from family members, and a large road atlas of the kind people relied on before GPS was common. Investigators dust the vehicle for fingerprints and find Adnan's prints on certain items. That fact is not automatically incriminating, as he had been in her car while they were dating. But fingerprints become part of the narrative because the case lacks a single definitive forensic answer. Notably, Jay's fingerprints are not found on items inside the car, according to trial discussion. That absence is not proof of innocence either. People can be in vehicles without leaving usable prints. Yet, it becomes another point of public speculation in a case already filled with ambiguity. In the trunk, investigators locate papers and envelopes. One envelope postmarked October 3rd, 1998 carries Adnan's fingerprints, as does the card inside. This, too, may be ordinary residue from a relationship, but it is presented within the state's narrative as evidence of access and familiarity. Relationship cases often carry this quiet complication. Shared spaces and shared objects can be interpreted either as innocent remnants or as suspicious proximity. The same fact can support two opposing stories, and ultimately a jury must decide which interpretation feels more coherent. Forensic limitations also enter the picture. In 1999, not every item is tested, partly because testing is expensive and time-consuming, and partly because investigative priorities shape what is examined. That does not excuse oversight, but it explains why decades later new testing can feel startling. The evidence itself has not changed, the technology has. In this case, those tools arrive years after the original trial. According to Jay, after the alleged viewing of the body in the trunk, he and Adnan drive around Baltimore for several hours discussing what to do. Jay describes stops along the way, including a call to a friend named Patrick. A call to Patrick appears on the phone records at 3:59 p.m., aligning with that portion of Jay's account. Jay also mentions a visit to a friend, often referred to as Christie's flat. Christie is described as a university student who typically had an evening class on Wednesdays, and later public discussion raises questions about whether she could have been home that afternoon. In cases like this, such details can appear minor, yet small and fragile facts sometimes become structural elements in larger narratives. As the evening unfolds, Jay tells police that he and Adnan bury Hae in Leakin Park. He describes digging a shallow grave, placing her inside, and leaving quickly. Phone records show 2 incoming calls in the 7 p.m. hour that connect to a cell tower serving the Leakin Park area. During trial, the prosecution uses those calls to suggest the phone was near the burial site. However, a technical complication emerges. A fax cover sheet from AT&T includes a disclaimer stating that incoming call location data should not be relied upon for precise geographic placement. That disclaimer is not heavily emphasized at trial, but years later it becomes central in appeals. The first trial begins in December 1999 and ends in a mistrial after a juror is exposed to prejudicial information. A second trial follows in early 2000. The prosecution presents a theory built around motive, a breakup, a new boyfriend, and what they describe as a wounded ego. Diary entries referencing arguments and jealousy are introduced to support that narrative. It is emotionally recognizable and structured for coherence. The defense counters that there is no direct physical evidence tying Adnan to the act of killing. They argue Jay's statements are inconsistent and that the phone evidence is overstated. They point out that Adnan does not confess and that no witness places him with Hae during the critical window. Adnan does not testify, Jay does, over several days. On February 25, 2000, the jury returns guilty verdicts on charges including first-degree murder, kidnapping, false imprisonment, and robbery. He is sentenced to life imprisonment plus 30 years. The jury deliberates for roughly 2 hours. Some interpret that speed as certainty, others view it with concern. For Hae's family, it represents a form of closure, and for Adnan's family, it is devastation. At the time, the case remains largely local. It becomes widely known 14 years later. In 2014, the podcast Serial revisits the case and raises questions about memory, evidence, and the reliability of Jay's account. The series does not declare Adnan innocent or guilty, instead resting deliberately in uncertainty. That uncertainty expands public scrutiny. Documents are revisited, timelines are debated, and cell tower evidence is re-examined. An alibi witness, Aisha McLean, becomes widely discussed. She states that she saw Adnan at the Woodlawn Public Library around 2:30 p.m. on January 13th, which, if accurate, would place him away from Hae during a key period. She was not called at trial, and years later, Adnan argues ineffective assistance of counsel, partly on that basis. His trial attorney, Christina Gutierrez, is experienced and regarded as skilled, though later questions arise regarding her health during that period. The legal process stretches over years through appeals and reversals. In 2016, a judge vacates the conviction based on ineffective assistance related to cell phone evidence, though later appellate decisions reinstate it in 2019. In September 2022, Baltimore prosecutors again move to vacate the conviction, citing concerns about evidence disclosure and newly surfaced information regarding other possible suspects, alongside DNA testing that does not include Adnan on certain items. A judge grants the motion, and Adnan is released after more than 23 years in prison. Charges are later dropped, suggesting a decisive shift, yet the case does not settle there. In August 2024, the Supreme Court of Maryland rules that the 2022 vacatur hearing did not provide adequate notice to Hae's family and orders a new hearing. This ruling addresses procedural fairness rather than guilt or innocence, but procedure is fundamental to legitimacy. In March 2025, a Baltimore judge reduces Adnan's sentence to time served under Maryland's Juvenile Restoration Act, allowing him to remain free under supervised probation. Legally, the case remains layered, and emotionally, it remains unresolved. Let us return to Jay Wilds, because Jay sits at the center of the original conviction. One point emerges clearly from his own interviews and testimony. Jay admits that he lies at least some of the time. The question, then, is not whether his story changes, but what those changes mean. Several possibilities are discussed, sometimes quietly and persistently. One interpretation is that Jay lies to minimize his own involvement, while the core account remains true. Another is that he is pressured, guided, or influenced into shaping a version that aligns with phone records. A third suggests he may be more centrally involved than he admits. And a fourth, though rarely embraced in court without strong evidence, is that he is not involved at all, and that the story is constructed. Public debate may entertain all of these possibilities. Courts and juries tend to require firmer footing. What remains certain is that Jay's statements do not stay stable. In one account, the trunk viewing happens near Edmondson Avenue. In another, it takes place at Best Buy. Years later, the location shifts again. Jay also describes Adnan removing items from Hae's car: a bag with a brown leather bottom, keys, a wallet. Yet some of the items he claims were removed are later found inside the vehicle. This raises difficult questions. Did Jay see these items earlier in the school year? Was he describing objects he already knew? Did he misremember? Or did he offer details that made the story feel more credible? Time complicates those questions. As years pass, narratives harden, and people often become attached to interpretations. Attachment can grow louder than evidence. Turning now to Leakin Park. Baltimore's Leakin Park spans roughly 1,200 acres, and in daylight functions as an ordinary park with trails, trees, and roads cutting through it. Yet it carries a reputation because bodies have been found there before. That does not mean murders occur there often. Bodies are transported there. Still, reputation colors perception. Hae is discovered there on February 9th in a shallow grave that appears hurried. There is no definitive forensic evidence placing Adnan at the burial site, and no DNA recovered from soil or clothing conclusively ties him to that act. At trial, the state relies heavily on Jay's eyewitness account and on phone data interpreted as supporting it. The defense argues that the phone data lacks precision, that incoming calls should not be used in the way they were presented, and that tower coverage is broad rather than exact. Years later, those arguments gain traction in appellate proceedings. Another element, sometimes overlooked, is Hae's pager. The pager itself is never recovered, and pager records are not obtained. If she received a page after school that day, it is possible that information is lost. It is a quiet gap, but a real one. There's also discussion that Hae may have planned to see Dawn that afternoon, and that friends recall references to the mall. Some witnesses describe seeing her near campus in the early afternoon, though accounts vary slightly across interviews. Once again, memory is asked to reconstruct minutes that did not seem important at the time. Regarding Don Clindenst, he is 22 and employed at Lentz Crafters. He tells police that he and Hae had recently begun dating, that she stayed at his home in Bel Air on January 12th, and that they spoke by phone late into the night. During that call, Adnan reportedly reached Hae to provide his new cell phone number. On January 13th, Don works at the Hunt Valley location rather than Owings Mills, and his manager confirms his shift. The fact that police do not reach him until after midnight later becomes a point of discussion. It is important to remain measured here. An imperfect alibi or delayed contact is not proof of guilt. In high-profile cases, however, irregularities attract attention, and speculation can expand quickly. We will keep the tone steady. Stepping back, it is necessary to remember that at the center of this case is Hae herself. Years of public debate can reduce a person to a timeline, a set of call logs, or a court filing. Yet, in the recovered items from her car, the sports equipment, the agenda book, the senior portrait proofs, the Shakespeare text, the flowers wrapped in plastic, the floppy disk labeled school stuff, there is evidence of a life still unfolding. These are not dramatic clues, they are reminders that a person existed and had a future in motion. On January 13th, that motion stopped. In prolonged legal battles, the identity of the victim can drift as arguments focus on evidence and procedure. But the beginning remains unchanged. Hae Min Lee is 18 years old. She leaves school. She does not arrive at daycare. She never comes home. That absence remains permanent. In late February of 1999, detectives examine Adnan's new cell phone records and notice something that stands out. The number called most frequently on January 13th is not a close friend of Adnan's, but belongs to Jen Pusatary, a friend of Jay Wilde's. Her house number appears multiple times, along with her pager number. To investigators still mapping social connections, this suggests a link worth exploring, and they decide to speak with Jen. On February 26th, detectives go to Jen's home and arrive as she is getting into her car. She tells them she cannot speak at that moment and says she will contact them later. Afterward, Jen goes to see Jay Wilde's at his workplace, an adult video store. She tells him police have come asking questions and asks what she should do. According to Jen, Jay tells her to speak with them. That evening, she goes briefly to the police station, but does not provide a full account. The following day, February 27th, she returns with her mother and a lawyer and gives a more detailed statement. This becomes the first formal narrative that directs investigators clearly toward Jay. Once Jen speaks in that way, Jay becomes unavoidable. In her fuller interview, Jen describes January 13th as beginning normally. She is on winter break from college and goes to work. While at work, she calls Jay and invites him over later. Jay agrees and asks for a ride because he does not have a car. Later, she says Jay contacts her again and tells her he will make his own way to her house. Jen states that she arrives home between 12:30 and 1 p.m. and that Jay shows up between 1 and 1:30 driving Adnan's car and carrying Adnan's cell phone. She says Jay tells her he is waiting for a call expected around 3:30 p.m. later that afternoon, sometime around 3:30 or 3:45. She recalls Jay receiving calls. She does not know who they are from or what is said. Between roughly 3:45 and 4:15, Jay leaves her house, and Jen departs shortly afterward to pick up her parents. She returns home around 6 or 6:30, has dinner, and later describes communicating with Jay through her pager. She says there was a pager message indicating where to pick him up. That detail becomes debated later because many assume pagers displayed only numbers. In the late 1990s, however, some pagers could store voice messages, functioning almost like a portable answering system. Jen's description is not automatically impossible. She also recalls confusion about pickup locations, a message suggesting one place, then a change. She remembers calling Adnan's cell phone at one point and speaking briefly with him, being told Jay would call her back. Eventually, she describes picking Jay up at Westview Mall and noticing that he seems unsettled. These details sound clear when isolated, but once compared against phone records, the timing becomes less certain. This is the central tension in Jen's role. She may be accurate about the sequence, that Jay had Adnan's car and phone, that she picked him up later, that he indicated something serious had occurred, while being inaccurate about specific minutes. That is not unusual. Witnesses often remember order better than clock time. Investigators understand this, but courts and the public sometimes struggle with it because times feel concrete, and they are not concrete unless documented. As a result, Jen's account sits in two categories at once: helpful and frustrating. Some people describe it this way: Adnan's account has too few details, Jay's account has too many, and Jen's account falls somewhere between. The phone record does not align perfectly with any of them. It aligns only after interpretation. That is part of what makes this case enduring. The crime itself is not complex, but reconstructing it becomes so. When detectives revisit Jen on February 27th, and she appears with counsel, her statement shifts in clarity. Appearing with a lawyer does not automatically imply deception, but it does suggest caution. Words become shaped not only by memory, but by risk. If Jay is telling the truth, then anyone who assisted him later may face consequences, even if their involvement was limited to transportation or silence. Once Jen provides her fuller statement, investigators move quickly toward Jay. His first major recorded interview takes place on February 28th, the same day Adnan is arrested. Jay's account is structurally inconsistent from the beginning. He places events in one sequence and later revises them. He locates the trunk viewing in one area, then shifts it. He adjusts times and stops across different statements. These changes are documented and become central to later debate. Jay's credibility is complicated by one crucial fact. He leads police to Hae's Nissan Sentra. That discovery carries significant weight. For detectives, it signals inside knowledge. For later observers, it raises a question. If Jay is fabricating, how does he know where the car is? And if he is telling the truth about the core event, why do so many peripheral details shift? It is possible for someone to misstate certain elements and still describe the central act accurately. It is also possible for someone involved to shape a story that protects themselves. Both possibilities remain discussed. Returning to the phone records of January 13th, dozens of calls appear, but several draw repeated attention. One of the most discussed is the call to Nisha, a teenager from Silver Spring, Maryland, whom Adnan met at a New Year's Eve party shortly before Hae's disappearance. They exchanged numbers and spoke by phone. And when Adnan received his new cell phone on January 12th, Nisha was among the first people he contacted. On January 13th, there is a call placed to Nisha at 3:32 p.m. that lasts just over 2 minutes. This call becomes difficult to interpret. According to Adnan's later account, he is still at school during that window, waiting for track practice, and says Jay has both his car and phone. The question therefore arises, if Jay has the phone and does not know Nisha, why does the phone call her and remain connected for over 2 minutes? At trial, Nisha testifies that she recalls speaking with Adnan, and that at some point he put Jay briefly on the phone. She says she recognized Adnan's voice and remembers mention of a video store where Jay worked. The complication is that Jay does not appear to have begun working at that adult video store on January 13th. Accounts suggest his employment there begins later in January. That discrepancy introduces several possibilities. Nisha may be remembering a different call and merging details. She may recall the conversation accurately, but misplace the date. The mention of the video store may be imprecise, or the memory of time may be less reliable than the memory of speaking. The phone record remains fixed, 3:32 p.m., a call lasting just over 2 minutes. Whether that call represents a simple social exchange or a critical moment becomes one of the most enduring interpretive challenges in the case. Jen's timeline faces similar tension. The times she provides do not align perfectly with the phone log. In later discussions, questions are raised about when witness estimates diverge from documented records. It is often because human recollection drifts. Most people can reconstruct sequence more reliably than exact minutes. Phone records provide structure, but they also create a risk. If witness accounts are shaped to fit records too closely, interpretation can shift from confirming events to constructing them. That delicate boundary becomes part of the broader debate surrounding this case. Another witness enters the story, Christy, often publicly identified as Christy Vinson. She recalls an evening when Jay comes to her flat with Adnan. She describes Adnan as anxious and distracted, stepping outside to take calls. Her account becomes part of the prosecution's timeline. Later, however, people examine Christie's schedule. A detail that receives significant attention is that she was enrolled in a course that met on Wednesday evenings. Discussion emerges about whether she could have been home on January 13th at all, because she has said she could not have skipped that class without failing. Over time, Christy herself indicates that she may have the wrong date. This does not automatically erase her memory of the visit. It suggests the visit may have occurred on a different night. If so, a portion of the timeline used to support the state's theory becomes less stable. This is not a dramatic reversal, but it reflects what often happens when people are asked, years later, to isolate one Wednesday from many similar ones. Turning now to the cell tower testimony. At trial, the state calls an AT&T radio frequency engineer, Abe Warunovitz, who explains how towers operate and how calls connect. He testifies that certain calls align with the state's narrative, including calls that, according to the prosecution, place the phone in the vicinity of Leakin Park during the 7 p.m. hour. Years later, attention focuses on an AT&T fax cover sheet that includes a disclaimer stating that incoming call location data should not be relied upon for precise geographic placement. That disclaimer becomes central in post-conviction proceedings. The tension here must be handled carefully. Some experts argue that whether a call is incoming or outgoing does not fundamentally change which tower handles the connection. Others suggest that record-keeping practices and switching behavior could introduce inconsistencies. Even the podcast that renewed global interest in the case describes difficulty obtaining a fully satisfying explanation for the disclaimer's language. The practical reality is this: the original jury heard cell evidence presented with confidence. Later proceedings questioned whether that confidence reflected the true limits of the technology. When evidence appears more precise than it actually is, it can influence how a jury weighs it. Setting the towers aside, the trial ultimately rests on a story carried primarily by Jay. In his account, Adnan lends him the car and phone, later calls him after school, and says, "Come and get me." Jay says he picks Adnan up, is shown Hae's body, drives around with him, visits others, and eventually helps bury her in Leakin Park. The difficulty lies not in the outline, but in the details. The exact sequence of stops, the specific locations, and the order of events shift across interviews. The defense emphasizes these changes, and public debate continues because of them. Another factor complicates matters. Jay admits helping to bury Hae. That is an admission of involvement after the fact. Yet, he does not serve prison time and receives a sentence that includes probation. For many, this raises questions. One explanation is cooperation. Prosecutors frequently negotiate with cooperating witnesses. Another is that the state views Jay as an accessory rather than the principal actor. A third is practical. Without Jay's testimony, the state may believe conviction is unlikely. Cooperating testimony is inherently complicated, not because it is automatically false, but because the witness has incentive to present events in a way that satisfies the prosecution. When stepping back to consider the physical evidence, the direct ties between Adnan and the killing are limited. There is no DNA placing him at the burial site, no blood evidence connecting him to the act, no weapon recovered, and no confirmed eyewitness to the killing itself. The state's case is constructed from Jay's testimony, supported by Jen's statement, supported by recovery of the car, supported by phone records, and framed by a motive theory rooted in the breakup. It is a circumstantial structure. Circumstantial cases can be powerful, but they are also sensitive to instability. When one element is questioned, the entire framework feels the strain. The prosecution's motive theory centers on jealousy and rejection. They argue that Adnan struggled with Hae moving on to Dawn and introduced diary entries describing possessiveness and tension. The defense counters that teenage jealousy is common and not proof of homicide, that there is no documented threat, and that Adnan continued his normal routines. Motive provides narrative coherence, but it is not itself proof of action. After conviction, years pass. Adnan maintains his innocence, legal teams change, and appeals move forward. In 2014, the podcast Serial, hosted by Sarah Koenig, introduces the case to a global audience. Collective attention follows. Documents circulate, timelines are reconstructed, and witness statements are examined line by line. This renewed scrutiny highlights potential weaknesses, but also introduces new noise. Two themes recur repeatedly in subsequent hearings: the interpretation of the cell tower evidence and whether Adnan received effective assistance of counsel. Aisha McLean becomes central again. She states that she saw Adnan at the Woodlawn Public Library around 2:30 p.m. on January 13th. If accurate, that placement would matter. However, alibi testimony depends on corroboration. Questions arise about letters, dates, and the anchoring of memory. Library computer sign-in sheets are discussed, as is the fact that surveillance tapes are routinely overwritten. Even if such footage existed, it would likely have been erased before police focused on Adnan. A library security guard later indicates no memory of seeing him that day. That does not disprove Asia's account. It underscores how quickly ordinary spaces become untraceable. In 2022, the case shifts again when Baltimore prosecutors move to vacate Adnan's conviction, citing concerns about evidence handling and disclosure, along with DNA testing that does not include him on certain items. The motion is granted, and Adnan is released. Charges are later dropped, which for many appears decisive. Yet the process is challenged by Hae's family, who argue they did not receive adequate notice of the hearing. Maryland's highest court rules that the hearing must be redone to honor victims' rights statutes. The conviction is procedurally reinstated pending proper notice, though Adnan remains free. In March 2025, a judge reduces his sentence to time served under Maryland's Juvenile Restoration Act, placing him on supervised probation. The conviction remains on record, but he is not returned to prison. The legal posture is layered and unusual. A conviction stands, the defendant is free, and the victim's family continues to believe justice has been compromised. Public debate persists, returning to the constant truth beneath the procedural layers. Hae is still gone. A teenager with lacrosse sticks in her car, senior portrait proofs, a school agenda, and a Shakespeare text. A young woman expected to pick up her cousin that afternoon. Her absence was first noticed not by investigators, but by a daycare routine that did not occur. Tragedy often begins not with spectacle, but with a small break in pattern, a missed pickup, an unanswered phone, a shift at work that begins without you. Later, the missing person becomes a homicide case, and nothing feels ordinary again. Here, we do not raise our voices or pursue sensational certainty. We hold the facts, acknowledge what is known, recognize what remains contested, and allow the story to rest where it truly rests, in complexity. In the months following the 2025 sentence reduction, the narrative continues to unfold in ways that remind us how certain stories extend far beyond courtrooms. In September 2025, HBO releases a surprise addition to its documentary series, The Case Against Adnan Syed, titled Part 5. The Tree Grew. The episode arrives 6 years after the original 4-part series, directed by Academy Award-nominated filmmaker Amy J. Berg. It is not a retelling, but a continuation, a quiet extension of the thread that began with the podcast serial and has moved through documentaries, appeals, and years of public conversation. The title itself suggests something organic. A tree does not stop growing simply because a moment passes. It develops rings, branches, and new directions. In the same way, this case, rooted in 1999, continues reaching into the present. We approach this chapter slowly, placing each piece carefully, because even in 2025, the story resists simplification. It grows layer by layer, revealing not only facts, but the human cost of uncertainty. The episode begins where the legal saga last shifted in 2022, following Adnan through his release after more than 23 years in prison. He is now in his early 40s, stepping into a world profoundly different from the one he left at 17. The camera lingers on quiet adjustments, reunions with family learning technology that did not exist when he was incarcerated, reflecting on years that cannot be returned. His voice is measured. He speaks of gratitude, but also of weight. freedom is not an ending. It is a beginning shaped by probation, scrutiny, and the continued presence of a conviction that remains on record. The filmmakers allow space for stillness. They show how incarceration reshapes not only the individual, but the family around him. His mother, Shamim, appears with the quiet endurance of decades spent visiting a prison. His brothers speak about holidays marked by absence and a childhood interrupted. These moments serve as a reminder that justice systems ripple outward, affecting lives beyond the accused. The central development of Part 5 arises from a new turn. A suspect who had been interviewed during the original 1999 investigation, but not pursued as a primary lead, is later arrested for assaulting a woman. The documentary presents the development without sensationalism. The arrest prompts Adnan's legal team, led by Irika J. Suter, to revisit earlier investigative files. They argue that this new information warrants renewed scrutiny of Hae's murder and question whether prior leads were fully explored. The episode also revisits previously undisclosed notes from the original investigation, suggesting alternative theories and possible additional suspects. There is renewed discussion of DNA evidence from items connected to the case, including testing conducted in 2022 that did not include Adnan. The documentary frames these developments not as conclusions, but as reasons for continued inquiry. A legal and political tension follows. At the time, the Baltimore State's Attorney's Office, under Marilyn Mosby, supports reconsideration of aspects of the case. Later commentary includes perspectives from Ivan Bates, who succeeds Mosby and offers his view that the core evidence, particularly Jay's testimony and the phone records, still supports the original conviction. The exchanges are measured, yet the stakes remain clear. As with earlier media coverage, the documentary does not declare innocence or guilt. It remains in the gray space. Archival prison interviews show Adnan speaking about faith and time, about the way confinement alters a person's sense of scale. After his release, the camera follows him as he works with the Prison and Justice Initiative at Georgetown University, assisting others with reentry. The portrayal emphasizes continuity of life rather than verdict. Hae's family appears through archival material and statements. Her brother, Young Lee, speaks about the pain of revisiting the loss with each legal development. The episode acknowledges that victims, families often experience prolonged uncertainty when cases remain publicly debated. Footage from the February 2025 hearing shows emotional testimony from both sides. Ultimately, Judge Jennifer Schiffer reduces Adnan's sentence to time served under the Juvenile Restoration Act, leaving him free under supervised probation, while the conviction remains intact. The documentary also explores systemic themes: investigative pressure, reliance on shifting witness testimony, and the handling of forensic evidence. It references broader political contexts without assigning definitive motives. Prosecutors are portrayed as operating within complex systems where professional judgment, institutional culture, and public expectation intersect. The metaphor behind the title emerges from Adnan himself. He compares time in prison to a tree growing around a fence, incorporating obstacles into its structure. He reflects on how the case has shaped him, even as he has continued to grow within it. The episode closes without resolution. It suggests that some stories do not end neatly. They continue evolving as evidence, interpretation, and public understanding shift. Since the episode's release, discussion has intensified again. Online forums debate the meaning of DNA findings and revisit long-standing questions about witness testimony. Some argue that the developments demand exoneration. Others maintain that the circumstantial case remains persuasive. Hae's family expresses frustration with continued media focus, reminding audiences that for them, this is not narrative, it is enduring loss. As of early 2026, no additional legal rulings have altered the case's posture. Adnan remains free, living under supervised probation. The conviction remains in place. The questions remain as well. Was justice served, or is it still unfolding? We have placed the final pieces before us. The story rests again, not in certainty, but in complexity. Let the evening settle. Let the details soften. There is nothing more to resolve tonight.